All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome back to Self-Righteous Blood, where we've been studying the biblical book of Judges. This series is intended to be taken in order, and if you'd like to see this from the beginning, you can go back on my Facebook timeline, or I also post these on YouTube if you'd like to see it there. But if you don't really care about that sort of thing, then of course you're welcome to join us whether you've been caught up or not. We are studying the book of Judges, and last week we finished up with chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where the preface section of the book of Judges ends. That's sort of like the introductory part of Judges. And it starts into this area of Judges where it's really more about the accounts and specifically who the judges are. We were introduced to the first three judges. That would be Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Talks about Othniel delivering the Israelites from the hand of the Mesopotamians under Cushan Rishathaim. And in the case of Ehud, how he manages to deliver the Israelites about a generation later from the hand of the Moabites under King Eglon. Shamgar only gets one sentence about him, but it mentions that he apparently delivered the Israelites from the Philistines, although we don't know much more about that. In this chapter, we're going to be introduced to one new judge, maybe two new judges, and we'll talk about that. But our two main characters for Judges chapter 4 are Deborah and Barak. Barak's one of these people, by the way. You might hear me pronounce him about four different ways. It's difficult for me for whatever reason, so if I'm not consistent about it, I apologize. But let's go ahead and start reading about them. Judges chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Remember this cycle that keeps happening in the book of Judges. Chapter 2 described it for us. It starts with the people doing what God wants, and so he blesses them, and then they stop doing what God wants, and he doesn't bless them anymore. He has somebody come in and oppress the people, but because they are oppressed, they humble themselves, they go back to the Lord, and he raises up one of these judges to deliver them. Deborah is certainly unique in a couple of ways, the most obvious being that she is the first and only female listed among the judges. This flies in the face of a common idea that is put out that the Bible is somehow sexist, and one of the goals of the Old Testament is to slander female rulers. It's true that the only female queens later that we'll see in the monarchy period of Israel were very bad ones. The only one that I can think of who seems to have been ruling completely independently of her husband would have been Athaliah. You might pronounce that Athaliah. And she was wicked. She killed all of her own grandsons in order to secure her own power. And then the more famous one, who was not ruling on her own, but was certainly more powerful than the queen of Israel was supposed to be, that would be Jezebel. Jezebel's got this weird thing going on right now, by the way, where people are almost trying to justify her beforehand. It comes from the mistaken notion that the big problem with Jezebel was sexual sin. And while I have no doubt that Jezebel was guilty of sexual sin, that's not why she is seen as such a particularly bad queen. Idolatry and violence is what makes Jezebel such a bad queen. The only time sexuality is connected to Jezebel is actually in the New Testament book of Revelation, in which a comparison is made to apparently some person in one of the seven churches of Asia who the Revelation writer John calls Jezebel and accuses her of sexual sin, although even in this case it's probably talking about idolatry. If you're very familiar with the scripture, the sin of idolatry is often associated with the sin of adultery. So it's not really a good idea to go back and look at Jezebel and say she wasn't that bad. Yes, she was that bad. She was terrible. But the idea that these are just insecure males who are slandering these female rulers because they can't handle the idea of a female ruler, it doesn't really match up with the Bible, because here you have a female ruler among the judges, period. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the oppressors here for a moment. It says that God, during this period, has raised up Jabin, king of the Canaanites. The name Jabin has actually appeared before in the book of Joshua. Jabin was stated as being king of Hazor, and sure enough, it says that this king of the Canaanites ruled from Hazor. It makes it decently likely that once again we're running into one of these names, which is actually a title. You know, we saw that a couple of times before. I think in the book of Judges, we've already seen that with Adonai Bezek, right? That just means Lord of Bezek. There are other places where there's a decent chance where somebody is given a name, and that might be a title for the ruler. We understand that when it's something like Pharaoh. That's probably true with Jabin as well, or at least it could be. He oppresses the people cruelly for 20 years. I introduced Deborah already, didn't even read about her yet, so let's go ahead and read about her. Verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. Something else that makes Deborah unique is she's also described as a prophetess. We don't see a lot of prophetesses within the Bible, but they are absolutely there, and Deborah is certainly one of the more prominent ones. By the way, it also happens within the New Testament. The daughters of Philip were considered prophetesses. Apparently, the office of prophet was not something that was limited only to males, although it would appear, at least based on the record we have, that the majority of them were male. But it certainly wasn't a requirement, and so you have this prophetess who is still a wife, but she is judge. And I mentioned there were a couple of things that make her unique, one being that she's female, of course, two, that she's a prophetess. I don't know if you could describe most of the judges as prophets at all. You don't really seem to see the same things from them. And then the last thing you see that makes her unique among the judges is she actually does some judging. Look over here. Verse 5, she used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. You remember at the beginning of the book, we mentioned that if it were up to me, I wouldn't call this the book of Judges. I would call it the book of deliverers, because it would appear that the main role of judges was to be a military leader first. And you don't really see them doing all that civil administration type of thing. Not so much judging from the judges. Deborah's an exception to this rule. It says she would go and she would find this palm to sit under, and people would come up to her for judgment. So she was a judge who was actually doing some judging. So there's a few reasons Deborah is unique. And it appears she was very good at it as well. Verse 6. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, Go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun? All right, something else that makes Deborah unique and different from the rest of the judges is that she doesn't appear to be much of a personal warrior. That makes sense. She's a woman. And what's the famous phrase about the Colt revolver? God made all men equal. Or I'm sorry, God made all men, but Samuel Colt made all men equal. The idea being that before a certain period in time, war was a lot more about your physicality. Today, it's not so much. It doesn't matter how tough you are. If you take a bullet, it's going to kill you. But back in the day, the physical toughness and size and strength of the warrior was going to make a really big difference on how effective they would be. And so, of course, it makes sense that a woman probably wouldn't be taking that particular role even today. Even while we see modern militaries, which do employ women in combat, we still focus mainly on men, but especially if we were still back in those hand-to-hand combat days, it would just be irresponsible to have a woman who would be fighting as if they were just as strong as a man. Perhaps God could have raised her up and given her supernatural abilities, much like she did with Samson, or much like he did with Samson, but he chose not to. And so we have this other character who's going to actually lead the Israelites, and that's Barak. Now, the book of Judges does not call Barak a judge, but the book of Hebrews does. That's in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32. He's mentioned along with the other judges, so it's quite reasonable to call him a judge. And he is a judge in the more traditional sense, though. He's the military leader. He's the deliverer. And so he's going to be fighting on behalf of Deborah. He apparently has a lot of respect for Deborah as well, because Deborah has just said, you're going to take 10,000 troops from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and you are going to go to the river Kishon. Did we get that far? Nope. Verse 7, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So, she's a prophetess. She's speaking on behalf of God. So she goes up to Barak, says you're supposed to get 10,000 troops from Zebulun and Naphtali. Remember that at this time, the Israelites were highly divided, so they didn't have one big army, for example. It seems that all the tribes had their own armies. Perhaps it wasn't even the entirety of Israel that was being oppressed by Jabin at this point. Maybe it was mostly these central tribes like Zebulun and Naphtali, and maybe the more far-flung tribes, such as Dan or Judah, maybe they weren't being that far oppressed by the Canaanites. Hard to say, but nevertheless, they don't really appear to deal much with this particular problem. Now, later in chapter 5, there are going to be a few other tribes that are mentioned that do take place, which would be Benjamin, Ephraim, Issachar, and then Machir, which is not one of the 12 tribes of Israel, but that would be one of the clans of Manasseh, which is. And if you notice, all of those seem to be sort of towards the center of Israel. But right now, it's just going to be those two tribes, and probably later on in the war, the rest of those tribes are going to help join the coalition. You're supposed to take 10,000 troops, go to the river Kishon. One of the commentators supposed that the fact that it's called the river Kishon would indicate that this might have been during a flooding time. The river Kishon, especially at this time, I believe, had a large variance in how much of it of a river versus just a small stream it could be. Basically, during the wet seasons, it would be a river. I come from a place where there's a lot of really big rivers, and so I probably would still consider it a creek, but if you ever look at some of the rivers in this area, the Jordan River, I would call that a creek if I lived nearby it, but you could probably say it would be comparable to the Jordan River in some way during the rainy season, but a stream during the drier seasons. And so the fact that it is called the river here, the commentator supposed that this might indicate that this was tactics on the part of Deborah, or more realistically the Lord, that there would be a sudden rain upon this place, which would cause the chariot advantage. Remember, we talked about how important chariots were in this kind of warfare. The chariot advantage would be taken away by being stuck in the mud. That's what the commentator supposed. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think that's a big leap simply by calling it the river Kishon, but perhaps that's what happened. Who knows? Verse 8, Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So Barak says to Deborah, if you go with me, I'm going to go ahead with you. But if you don't, I'm not going. It's a bizarre thing. And I'm not 100% sure what to make of it, to be honest. On one hand, he seems to have a lot of respect for Deborah. He has enough respect to say, I believe I can do it if you are there, which might indicate also how respected she was among the Israelites in general. On the other hand, he was told to go, whether she was coming or not, and you think about it, as I mentioned, women weren't all that going to be all that useful in these types of battlefields. I suppose she would have been a morale booster, but he shouldn't have needed that. So I'm not 100% sure what to make of it. I think the next thing that we're going to see happen, though, I think that might be some indication, at least in my head, that God was going to put somebody like Barak to shame, or at least show him how powerful he really was. Because as I mentioned, it would have been very shameful for somebody to actually die in combat to a woman. God's going to use that. Verse 9, and she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went with him at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. So this is what Deborah says. Yes, I'll go with you, but God's not going to glorify you. They're going to give Sisera, by the way, I think I forgot to mention that under King Jabin, the main general of his army was a man named Sisera. Sisera is going to be given into the hands of a woman, and it appears that's almost a punishment or showing God's power specifically to Barak. We can think of what we want as far as the inherent feeling towards women on this, but I would look at it similar to the effect of if you had a softball game with little kids. You ever been in the middle of a casual softball game, and then somebody's 4 or 5-year-old kid gets up to bat, and the exact same thing happens every time. We get whatever swing we can, and we tell the kid to go, and then everybody pretends to get them. You ever do all that, and then somebody actually counts the point for that? It gets a little weird at that point. I suppose that might be a sign that I take softball a little bit too seriously, but honestly, that isn't a fair thing to do. And I think people would have looked at it a similar way if they had died by the hand of a woman. This isn't the first time, by the way, that the cultural idea of shamefulness at being killed by a woman will show up in the book of Judges. But be aware of that here. So let's go ahead and see the battle. They take the 10,000 men. Now we have verse 11. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. I just noticed something that I need to do a little bit more research into. The father-in-law of Moses goes by 2 names in the book of Exodus. One of them is Ruel, and the other one is Jethro. In here, it says that the Kenites had descended from the father-in-law of Moses, and it calls him Hobab. So I'm a little bit interested in that. I didn't catch it until just now, but I want to look into that and see. If, by the way, if anybody has any insight on that, I'd be very curious to see it. Just as a cursory glance at it, I do know that it's a possibility that Moses had one father-in-law at first, being Ruel or Jethro, but he might have gotten remarried later on. His wife Zipporah ends up leaving him for a bit, and then later it talks about him having a wife, but maybe that was a second wife. It's a little unclear within the Bible. So I'd be curious if anybody has any insight on that. Please feel free to share. But I just now noticed that. Anyway, it talks about the Kenites. They are descendants of the father-in-law of Moses. And apparently, it would seem that the Kenites, by the way, you might wonder why we've gotten away from this battle that was being pitched up. Well, the Bible is not a book meant to entertain, and so it's going to take us away from the action for a moment. We're going to get back to it, but I did want to set up this man named Heber the Kenite. And the Kenites, it would seem, as a general rule, allied themselves with Jabin, the king of Canaan. That's probably part of the reason it calls him king of Canaan here. Likely he had an alliance of several Canaanite tribes here, and apparently even a couple of tribes that weren't Canaanites. But Heber had taken his family, maybe his whole clan, and had separated himself from the main Kenites. And perhaps the Canaanites don't know about that. Anyway, verse 12. When Sisera was told that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, Up! For this day is in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men and following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth-hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. A criticism against the Old Testament is that God must not have been all that powerful because he wasn't able to make the Israelites victorious over any of the Canaanite tribes which had chariots. That is simply untrue. It was not the failure of the Lord that the Israelites did not take over tribes which had chariots. It was a flaw in the Israelites. They were afraid of the chariots, and even though God could have brought them victory, they were thinking they were doing this by their own power. And when they don't do that, such as they do here under Barak, they're able to defeat 900 chariots. It doesn't even say how many foot soldiers Sisera had, but presumably had a whole lot more soldiers than he did chariots. If you know much about ancient battle, you would know that the most dangerous time of the battle is actually not when the big clash is happening. The most dangerous time in the battle is during what we call the rout. It is when people are fleeing. Ancient warfare was more about the morale of the soldiers. It's not so much we're going to keep fighting against each other until somebody is completely worn down. It's we're going to keep fighting against each other until somebody breaks and flees. And that when the fleeing happens, that's when the real killing happens. And so it's a great morale booster if you're on the winning side to know that the other side has broken and fled. And that's precisely what happens during this battle. And a bunch of them try to flee, and they're all cut down at this time. But what about Sisera? Because it says he was supposed to die by the hand of a woman. Well, verse 17, But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. I need to correct myself because I misspoke a little bit earlier. Apparently, before this point, Jabin had some sort of alliance with specifically Heber the Kenite, not just the Kenites in general. But let's set the scene here for a moment. Sisera has just fled away from this particular situation. Once again, terrible thing, a shameful thing to flee away from battle, especially if you're in the general. The ancient Spartans, they would be so serious about not fleeing that when a Spartan soldier would go away for battle, his wife, or perhaps his mother, some woman in his life, traditionally would say, with your shield or on it. And the reason they would say that is if you were going to flee from battle, you would get rid of some of your extra weight. And so they would throw down their shields so they could, run away faster. But it was the tradition, specifically of the Spartans, maybe all Greeks, that if a dead man were brought back home, that they would bear him on his shield. And so the phrase, with your shield or on it, was essentially saying, if you're coming back home, you make sure you come back with your shield that you didn't throw down and flee with, or flee from, or it'd be better that if you come back dead. And this was said by these men's wives and mothers. It was important in ancient warfare to do that. So Sisera has already, and he wasn't a Spartan, but certainly this would still have been a shameful thing for him. And so Sisera flees from the battle on foot, which probably would be shameful. I'm guessing he went on a chariot, so he probably would have completely abandoned his men, probably did some hiding along the way, but he flees down to where Heber the Kenite is camped. And we're introduced to Jael, Heber's wife. It's a little bit concerning to me that I know so many Christian women whose favorite character in the Bible is Jael. But I suppose girl power, and we're going to see why. You can probably see why I'm a little bit concerned by that and why I try to be really nice to these women. But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, and do not be afraid." So he turned aside to her tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple. I will say that again. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg until his temple, until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. Jael was apparently on the side of the Israelites. Hard to say whether Heber had already been persuaded to that side, but Jael certainly was. She sees and recognizes Sisera as he is fleeing, and she basically says, "Hey, come over to my tent. I'll hide you. I'll take care of you." So that's what Sisera does. And she covers him with a blanket. He's tired, gives him milk to drink. If this was a modern thing, you'd imagine there'd be cookies involved as well. Very undignified by the Israelites' standpoint, or any of the ancient standpoints anyway. He's in a very vulnerable state. And when he falls asleep, Jael takes a tent peg and a hammer and hammers the thing through his skull. It gets pretty metal there. If you know somebody and their favorite character in the Bible is Jael, be nice to that lady. She looks up to some interesting characteristics. By the way, I'm not saying Jael did anything wrong here. When we are introduced a little bit to the character of Sisera in the next chapter, because it's going to be a little bit of review. I know he's dead now, but there's going to be some review of what had happened in the next chapter. Sisera deserved this. And when we talk next week about the kind of guy Sisera is, I'd be kind of surprised if you didn't agree with me, at least to some degree. And so Sisera is now dead by the hand of a woman. It's a death, and it's, by their standards, an extremely undignified death for Sisera. Verse 22, "And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said, 'Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking.' So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead, in the tent peg in his temple. So on that day God subdued Jabin the king of Canaan before the people of Israel, and the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan." After this, we don't get much details about the sort of battles that were going on during this war, but apparently they were pretty generally successful. After the death of Sisera, the rest of the Canaanites also fall until Jabin the king himself also falls. And that will end this more historical section about Deborah and Barak. Chapter 5, however, is still going to have Deborah and Barak. It's a sort of a bizarre section because it's much more poetic than the rest of the book of Judges. But Lord willing, that's what we'll get into next week. Until then, I love you all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you then. Bye.